Hello, friends. Welcome to the next installment of the book review series. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and today I will be taking a look at the book by Noel Wayne Pretila, here abbreviated as Justin's Retrieval of Myth. We'll take a look at the full title in a moment. Just to remind everybody, this is a book review service that introduces the book. I don't talk about the book in all its complexity. This is simply a launching pad for you to get to know a book and see whether you want to purchase it. I'm not here to promote or to demote any book, and there will be things that I miss and things that interest me. So take everything as you would, and just as any other piece of scholarship, and use this as a service for going the next step and finding out whether you want to pursue the book yourself. Okay, so as I said, that we are looking at Noel Wayne Pretila's book. The full title is Reappropriating Marvelous Fables, Justin Martyr's Strategic Retrieval of Greek Myth in the First Apology, and this is published by Cambridge, James Clark and Company in 2014. It is, I think, an important book and something useful for everybody interested in the interaction of Christianity and Hellenic culture, and specifically Hellenic mythology. Here we see the very earliest Christians, educated Christians, interacting with the Greek cultural heritage, which they could not avoid. And we see how initially they reacted. And that helps inform us about our own reaction. In the introduction, Pretila gives us a basic history of research of this question and is both critical and criticizing of other previous views, which he believes are too simplistic, in positing a negative versus a positive orientation. Justin Martyr is not negative or positive fundamentally. He displays a simultaneous suspicion and reverence toward myth, according to Pretila. Later in the book, we get the sense that the reverence toward myth is really on the part of Justin's audience. I myself would be hard-pressed to say that Justin is ever really reverent toward Greco-Roman myth. But what Pretila presents as a new paradigm, a new and dynamic paradigm, is not focusing on the evaluation of the myth, but on what is used and what isn't, and how that is explained by the social history. So he uses the terms incorporation and separation. That is, incorporation, what does Justin assimilate, and what does he ultimately want to distance himself from in terms of Greco-Roman mythology when he deals with it. And Pretila makes the claim that Justin wanted to prevent relapse or backsliding on the part of his audience. And it was for that reason that he had to address what was important to them, their cultural mythology, but in such a way as to demonstrate the supremacy of Christian mythology or Christian belief, as he says. And that is the basic rundown of the introduction. In Chapter 2, Pretila tackles the topic of the audience of the Apologies. And of course, he's well aware that in the preface, Justin specifically calls upon the reigning emperors at the time, and that is taken to be a matter of pretense, according to Pretila. He leans on Gamble, who talked about how ancient books would have been distributed and published, and Buck, who talked about mistakes made in the preface, which indicates to Pretila that the first apology and presumably most of Justin's work would have had an internal Christian audience, and therefore it was directed toward the shaping of a Christian believer. What Justin tries to do, essentially, is to show that Jesus better fits what Pretila, following older scholarship, calls the theos aner, or divine man paradigm, and here he leans on Charles Talbert in an article in the 70s. Basically, Jesus better fits the paradigm of deified, what I prefer to call deified men, by being deified through virtue, and that's consistent virtue, not through any misdeeds as the Greco-Roman deities are often accused of. Here, Pretila distinguishes between Justin's full and partial separation from the myth, so it's not an out-and-out rejection. Justin is trying to draw an analogy between Greco-Roman myth and Christian myth, and sometimes he is pulling away, sometimes he is trying to make connections, and so it's all very dynamic. But what we see is that Justin initially treats the material of myth in chapters 21 and 22 of the First Apology, and here he seems not ironic, but basically open to seeing connections between Greek and Christian myth. But by the time he gets to the 54 to 66, that is the chapters in the First Apology, the later chapters, he's much more intent on showing the demonic inspiration of myth and of rejecting, or as Pretila says, separating from myths in a more wholesale fashion. What Justin was trying to do, according to Pretila, is map a distinctive Christian social disposition, and that is not to alienate his audience, but to attract them, hook them, as it were, use what they know to then move them to some other place where, in effect, they can graduate out of or lose their dependency on their previous cultural heritage. Chapters 3 and 4 are really the heart of the book, and here is where Pretila talks about the actual content of what Justin is saying. And what he points out is that Justin follows a creedal structure for drawing parallels between Christ and other Greco-Roman deities. And so in that creedal structure, he begins with extraordinary birth, the extraordinary birth of the hero, then the healing power of the hero and the ability to raise the dead, then the suffering and death of the hero, and then the resurrection and ascension of the hero. And for each of these, he has distinct parallels. So in extraordinary birth, he points out that Perseus's mother was a virgin, and Ganymede and Hermes also had extraordinary roles to play in birth. Hermes' mother was Maya, and all these people had divine fathers, and this was very common in Greco-Roman myth. In terms of healing and raising the dead, well, this is the old pastime of Asclepius, who is son of Apollo, although Justin might seemed to confuse him as a son of Zeus. In terms of suffering and death, Justin pointed to Asclepius, who was tortured by a lightning bolt, Dionysus, who was dismembered, and Heracles, who was burned alive. Justin is aware that none of these deaths are really like in kind to the crucifixion, but he thinks it's sufficient to point out extreme suffering as enough of an analogy to Christ. And then finally, heroes or deified men who came back to life and ascended to heaven. These include the Dioscuri, or Castor and Pollux, Bellerophon, Ariadne, who became a constellation, and Caesar, or various Caesars who were deified by the Roman state. Accuracy really isn't altogether here, because Bellerophon, of course, was cast down from heaven, and probably Justin doesn't believe in the catasterism of Ariadne. Catasterisms are very kind of fantastical. And of course, although he might want to pay respect to the deified Caesars, the form of deification and their ascent to heaven is very different from Christ. But Justin is trying to hit the main points. It's almost tempting to say that he's superficial. I mean, he doesn't know or cite any of these myths in detail, but he sort of knows them as cultural sort of background information, the stuff that he's picked up. And remember that Justin grew up in Palestine, specifically Samaria, and he had experience in both Asia Minor and Rome. So over the years, and we know that Justin wasn't born a Christian, so over the years, these are the kind of stories that he's picked up, and he doesn't tell any of the stories in detail, perhaps because he's not interested, but perhaps also because he expects his audience to simply fill in the blanks. So here is Justin's attempt at incorporating, that is, to drawing what he considers to be true parallels between Greco-Roman figures and Christ. So we come to the next major topic, which is separation, what Pretila calls separation from mythology. Justin initially appears ironic in the early chapters, chapter 21 and 22, when he's trying to draw connections between Christian and the larger Greco-Roman culture. But ultimately, Justin's theory, his framework, is that demons have invented stories that they purposefully designed to imitate the life of Jesus. And demons got their information from Old Testament prophecies and histories. And so what they did was they learned the life of Christ before Christ existed. And in order to prime people, as it were, into considering the life of Christ a instance of miracle mongering and an unbelievable tale, a marvelous tale, they created tales of their own, which in a garbled way incorporated elements from the life of Christ. And so we learn that actually it's not really true that Greek mythology is a type of the Christian myth. What is really the case is that the Old Testament prophecies and histories are a type of the myth of Christ, and that the Greek and Roman stuff is really demonic invention. So What's interesting that Pretila points out is that Justin spends most of his time when he goes through the gods on the theme of extraordinary births. But of course, he treats all the major themes of the creed, that is healing and resurrection and ascension and suffering. And in all of these themes, Justin was doggedly concerned to demonstrate the supremacy of Christ, to show that he's better. It is, in effect, an act of Christian one-upmanship. And so ultimately, Justin is trying to transcend the myth in a way that the Greco-Roman myths, in such a way that he can essentially step over them and suppress them, and encourage his readers simply to pay attention to what seems to be Justin's chief interest after he became a Christian, that is, in Old Testament prophecies and of Jesus. Something also that Justin does, which Pretila does treat, Justin has a theory that the demons put forth the myths before Jesus, so as to confuse and condition people. But after the myths, demons used a kind of second strategy, that is, they put forward people whom Justin considered heretics, like Simon, Helen, Menander, and Marcion, after Christ's ascension. And so myths and heretics are really the two demonic strategies that are undermining Justin's own sense of what true Christianity is. And Pretila gives a short summary of Simon, Menander, and Marcion, not too much on Helen. But that's an interesting thing to point out, that heresiology and the criticism of Greco-Roman myth are two sides of the same apologetic maneuver. Chapter 5 is the final chapter, and in this chapter, Pretila discusses all the mythological material that doesn't fit the creedal structure of extraordinary birth, healing, ministry, suffering, and ascension. And here is where Pretila thinks that he can discern other types of, other theories, that is, of how myths were informed by truth. So according to the first and dominant theory, it was the demons who generated the myths as an imitation and garbled form of truth. But there's also the theory that the poets borrowed directly from scripture. And here, Pretila makes the claim, somewhat lacking in evidence, that the poets on the topic of eschatology, that is, the immortality of the soul and the eternal punishment of the wicked, were directly dependent on the Hebrew scriptures. And Justin cites the myths of Minos and Rhadamanthus, who are judges of the dead, Odysseus going to Hades, and the Elysian fields as a kind of eschatological reward. And all these myths, according to Pretila, would be directly dependent on scripture and not needing any demonic inspiration. And then Pretila makes even the bolder claim that some poets were directly inspired by the seminal logos. I myself don't see Justin ever saying this in any direct way, but according to Pretila, Menander's declaration that the creator is superior to the creation, and Homer's declaration that Zeus is the father of men and gods, is due to their direct inspiration by the seminal logos. And again, Justin is better known for saying that figures like Socrates and Heraclitus were inspired by the seminal logos he never, when he treats Menander and Homer, directly says that they were inspired by the Logos. But nonetheless, this is Pretila's theory, and I present it here for your evaluation. The conclusion is quite short, only 8 pages, but it's important and wraps up most of the discussion. In the conclusion, Pretila says that myths move dynamically in Justin's theory, that when you read the first part of the Apology, myths seem to be an established type of Christian myth itself, or Christian truth, if you will. And then in the middle part of the first Apology, 23 to 53, Greco-Roman myth sort of loses its status and it was more or less replaced by Old Testament types. So Pretila says that Greco-Roman myth continues as a provisional type, although to be honest, Greco-Roman myth really doesn't appear much in this section, if at all. And then finally, in the later section of the first Apology, Justin brings out the big guns, as it were, and shows that myth is a false antitype, and that the true premonitions or revelations of Christ all happened in the Old Testament, and ultimately then Greek myth should be bypassed by the Old Testament types. And although that Pretila wants to continue to call this theory a dynamic theory in which Justin is displaying both reverence and antipathy toward the Greco-Roman myths, I myself am convinced that this is more or less an overall antithetic presentation. That is Justin's overwhelming theory, which he gives early in the first Apology, that demons have invaded Earth and have created lies and fooled people, is his overwhelmingly preferred method of explaining Greek mythology. So I don't think that it is a binary between negative and positive, but I think overall, I think even Pretila would agree that Justin is really aiming to supplant Greco-Roman mythology by transcending it, using it, and then throwing it away as unnecessary, recasting it. And what he appropriates from the myth is rather minimal in the end. I would say he's much more interested in conforming Greek myths to his own Christian myth rather than the reverse. Although one can't completely exclude the idea that the story of Christ is also shaped by these other Greco-Roman gods and heroes. I would say primarily Justin has his imagination filled mostly with characters and verses from the Septuagint, and that determines an overall antithetic stance toward the Greco-Roman heritage. Justin is part of that heritage. He cannot avoid it, but he really is working with a theory of Kulturkampf, that is the clash of cultures. And this becomes even more emphasized by his disciple Tatian. And I encourage everyone to go check out my episode on Tatian in the Found Christianity series. For now, I just want to thank everybody for coming along to this book review. I hope it's helped you discern whether you want to purchase this book. I hope that all of you, regardless of what you do, remain eager to learn more sophisticated information about the confluence and mutual influence of Greco-Roman and Christian mythology. And wherever you come down, I hope that this work and other scholarly works can help you on your journey toward understanding. Till we meet next time, thank you again and take care.